Gentlemen, you are both drunk on cosmic wine.
Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Mark Sylvester.
And I'm Dr. Richard Schulman.
This is Alt Psych.
Well, welcome to the show. How are you, Rich?
I'm doing well, Mark. How's it going, buddy?
Great. What are we talking about today?
What are we talking about today? We're talking about the mind-body connection, which is sort of the basis for everything that we do, why we have Alt Psych.
Ah, yes. Indeed, our whole practice is based on this.
So everybody listen up.
Yeah, if you have a mind or a body, or I would say a heart or a soul, you definitely want to pay attention.
Well, I think it's important that you talk about a heart and a soul because, the first thing as I was thinking about this stuff, is that all that ancient wisdom, all those ancient practices are now being validated by our medical science. They're a little late to the party, but I'm glad they're joining in.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like we're seeing this ancient wisdom with a more contemporary feel.
Look, I'm a yogi. I spent all those years standing on my head doing yoga. And the one thing that I found when I did yoga is that it made me feel great. I ran for about 10 years. I must have run 10,000 miles. I got the runner's high twice in all those years. But with yoga, I got it every time. Every time when I was into yoga and I was in good shape, and I did the Ashtanga series, thank you, Yogi John, rest in peace. It always made me feel great. And I actually had several real metaphysical kinds of experiences while doing yoga. I had one shamanic journey, one where I really felt weightless when I was doing a headstand. So these are really spectacular experiences, but it doesn't have to be spectacular for it to be powerful. And the issue is that if you do yoga, if you're in a loving relationship, if you go out in nature, if you meditate, if you're in a spiritual community, the health outcomes are better.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great topic for the show today because medical research is validating and showing more and more, what our spirituality or our deep sense of connection does to promote our health. You joked before about it finally catching up to what we already knew. Science is filling in this ancient wisdom in a very nuts and bolts, pragmatic way that I think people can really understand. And why today is such a good topic is no one's really done a good job to sort of integrate that in the real-time world and real-time problems and the issues that are going on. And
well, we like our science to validate everything in this culture. We tend to forget that, like we wanted to say, does acupuncture work? Well, the Chinese have 5,000 years of doing it. And when it came here, our medical science says, oh, no, it has to be validated with research. Well, what about those 5,000 years of Chinese people using it? I think
that's anecdotal. That's 5,000 years of anecdotes.
Right.
Well,
so
I mean,
the first, and the other thing is, all those things that we talked about, going out in nature and doing yoga and meditating and being in a loving relationship, they're all kind of under the heading of holistic, as if we discovered this thing, 20 minutes ago.
Right, or it's new or in vogue, yeah.
And even just a few years ago, that was sort of new age tinfoil hat stuff. And now it's becoming more mainstream in terms of medicine. That more conventional doctors will recommend that you meditate or that you might do yoga. And for years, I made my practice with doctors sending me people who were not in loving relationships, and there was fallout from that, and some of the fallout is health.
Absolutely, and I think what folks will get out of the show today specifically is a better understanding of that. About this isn't something new or in fad. It's actually tied into our very ancient, even the actual evolutionary biology of the brain and the mind itself. And maybe that's a good time to start talking about state-dependent learning and memory and what's meant by that. What does that look like? How does that teach people about this mind-body connection?
Well, in psychology, there's very few laws that actually make any sense. It's usually theories, and little bit of evidence here, a little bit of evidence there. State-dependent learning is a law. The state you're in when you learn something determines how you remember it. I got through graduate school by juggling. I had a friend who taught us all how to juggle. We were really stressed. It was hilarious. We would all juggle. There'd be four of us who were totally neurotic, juggling like crazy. But let's imagine that you don't know how to juggle. And maybe you're the kind of person who goes into a bar, you have a few drinks, you're a little tipsy, and somebody says, hey, want to learn how to juggle? And you get it. It's really not overly hard to do if you're a little coordinated. Now the next morning you wake up and there's 3 tennis balls on your night table. You go, I think I learned how to juggle last night. But you can't remember it. Have a few drinks, the state you're in when you learned it, now you can juggle again. This is good. Yeah, I know school, you were in school a long time, weren't you?
Yeah, no, it reminds me of a story of a roommate I had in college. And he used to always say, hey, Mark, study high, test high. And I struggled to understand what he meant. Like, one, how is illegal drugs helping you perform on an exam? But that's irrelevant to the story. But I got to learn to appreciate the whole concept of state-dependent learning. And I joked with him. He was late for his final exams at the end of the year. And I said, hey, Phil, are you forgetting something? And he said, oh, yeah.
That's a pretty cool story. I just think of it, if you drink coffee to stay up all night, have a cup of coffee before you take the test. But your story,
it worked for him. It worked for him. I thought it was a great illustration of state-dependent learning. And somewhere Phil is doing quite well. He's designing computer chips for Intel, I believe. Okay,
so then he probably knows about that microdosing thing that they're doing.
Anyway, get a kick out of that.
Think about. I got another example for you. People will say, "Okay, I had a dream and now I can't remember it."
Oh yeah.
What I tell people to do is what you have to do is to write down maybe 2 sentences about some of the dream imagery before you go to the bathroom, because when you go to the bathroom, you change your psychophysiology. When you pee, you're different, and then I can't really remember it. If you write it down beforehand, you have a handle to go back and get it. Because once again, we're in state-dependent learning. You're in a certain psychophysiological state when you wake up. The dream is in that state. You want to remember it. You have to have another handle in order to do that. I guess the place where this is most important in my world, in my practice, is when we deal with trauma. Because trauma is encoded differently than other memories. So I'll give you an example. I had a very nice breakfast today. I hope you had one too. And when I think about it, there's no emotion attached to it. It's no big deal. But if I think about a car wreck that I had, now I actually have worked this one out. But for a time, I would think about that wreck and I'd get real nervous, like the wreck was happening, or I was feeling the fear of it. So what it means is that during trauma, we get a lot of trance phenomena. It's almost, and I know when I was in that wreck, what probably took 1 second was clearly a time distortion. My experience of the wreck was that it probably took about 20 seconds, and I almost hit the windshield when the seatbelt grabbed me and pulled me back into real time. So when I worked on it in my own personal therapy, I had to be in trance to actually process that information. People will not even be able to remember it sometimes because it's in a different state of consciousness. So that makes the stuff that we do either with hypnosis or the mind-body stuff I do, I call it emotional shifting process. There's somatoemotional release. A lot of the mind-body therapies are designed to connect with that level of consciousness so you can work the memory. People say, well, I don't understand. I've talked about this and I got worse. Well, the energy came up. There was no exit point. You weren't in the right level, or you got in that level and you had a flashback, you had a nightmare, you had a horrible startle response, you had sweating, you had anxiety, panic. Well, you know, you got into that state, and then the question is, how do you work with that energy at that state? So I call it, I'll give you another example of this. So let's say Mark is my therapist. Would you like to be my therapist today, Mark? And you ask me,
can I go the drug option and just drug you until you're asleep?
Well, I'm probably too hard a case for anybody, but so if you say to me, do you have any, are you scared of heights? And I go, no, I'm not scared of heights. So you have a metacommunication. You have your body saying one thing and your words saying another. And you may believe that you don't have any fear of heights, but some other part of you is saying yes.
So that's when the patient's out of touch with their mind-body connection.
Absolutely. And, you know, when I work with a body therapist, we call it an information detector because we want to know where the real information is. In psychotherapy, they train us to look for all these little things. I don't know if you've ever seen that show Lie to Me about the guy who interprets the body language. That show, you know, they did it for Hollywood, but the ideas were essentially correct, even though, they juiced it up and made it, so every time you get it, he would have the answer in a heartbeat. It isn't quite that easy. But it's still, that's how we get literally the information to help patients move through their traumas or whatever the issues are that are not easily accessible to just talking. Well, why don't you cut that out, Rich? There's therapy for you. Stop being a jerk, cut it out. Okay, sometimes that'll actually work, but that person doesn't need therapy.
And that goes along with what we talked about a little bit last week about being on the same frequency as someone energetically or vibrationally, or actually when you make a comment and it resonates with somebody, it speaks to that state-dependent learning and not only accessing traumas or memories, but even just communication not only with each other, but within ourselves, like you said, and congruities like that, which can lead to disease.
And some of the effects of treatment actually give evidence for this mind-body connection. And one of my old teachers told me that there are really only two issues in psychotherapy. How do you get in? What do you do when you're there? When he said, how do you get in my world, I would say that's accessing the state, the psychophysiological state the person was in when the trauma occurred, or where that issue is being stored, because the memory is instantaneous: mind, body, heart, spirit, boom. So the idea that I would want to talk to a therapist and then 3 days later go down and have somebody work on my body doesn't make any sense to me now. Sure. It's all available in that moment. And that's why I developed the process that I developed for treating trauma. And we're talking about a lot of psychological processes, and I think it's important to comment on the biology of this. And I happen to have an expert right across the nano universe from me. Would you like to tell us a little bit?
Well, yeah, we'll get into the biology in a second. There's a ton of biology, but what you were just saying made me think about like PTSD and veterans and certain triggers, even though they know that they're, like I'm thinking of a specific patient I had who struggled to reintegrate because of a lot of IED blasts and being in a constant state of war in Iraq and dealing with PTSD. And we talked about just subtle little triggers, external cues that would send him straight back. People think of PTSD as being more like shell shock, and there are severe cases where it can actually be that dissociative. And but it can also be for all of us on a much more subtle level. Certain triggers, certain cues set off certain patterns, and that has to do a little bit with the biology, which I want to talk about here in a second. But
if you take a combat vet and go out on the 4th of July, fireworks go off, they're back in the desert.
Yeah.
I mean, and You know, and there's three ways that you can encode this. One is a catastrophe. You're in a plane crash. That's one trial learning. But a soldier will be in a battle, then there may be several days between the next battle. So this constant having to deal with life-threatening stuff. And then there's something that if you're in kind of a more moderate thing, but you're in it every day, every hour, like a really dysfunctional family, all those things can get encoded in, and it's almost like you're creating circuitry, and that's how we'll get to the biology of this, is the circuitry that's created underneath that becomes a mediator, literally, of consciousness.
And not only from triggering, like in a detrimental way, but you're saying actually therapeutically that you can gradually trigger someone in your office to access the right emotional state, and then most importantly, know what to do about that, which we're going to talk about as well in a minute. But are there other techniques that that can not only trigger someone in the way that you know how to trigger them, whether that's bringing up a difficult trauma or something like that, but are there more physiologic things like acupuncture?
Well, there's no doubt that acupuncture is in my mind, there's no doubt acupuncture is the original mind-body medicine. The idea is if you go into the way Eastern medicine, Chinese medicine, Qi, Indian medicine, prana, it's sure that the body is electric, okay? 5,000 years of Chinese people talking about Qi and Luke Skywalker talking about the Force, it's kind of the same thing. So the idea that there's an emotional body does make a certain amount of sense to me. And acupuncture, so the meridians will, like the liver connects to anger. The spleen connects to anxiety. There's a beautiful architecture, inner architecture, of how these organ systems and and I'm going to call it electrical, an acupuncture physician would call it meridians, you know, energetic. But for a Western mind, think electricity, maybe it isn't exactly the same, but it's similar enough for us to conceptualize it. We know human body has electricity.
Well, and Nikola Tesla said to think of it in terms of vibration or frequency.
Well, isn't that the truth, man? And when you get into the spiritual world, it's all about vibration. And I think in the end, it's why music becomes such a great healer, why music is so important.
It may be that healthy way to get people attuned to a certain space.
Well, think about it. If you came into my office and the lights were really low, and there was something coiled under the desk, and you thought it was a snake, you know, I mean, most people, not everybody, some people like snakes, but most people would have a physiological reaction. They would get scared. The heart would race, mouth gets dry, palms get sweaty. Now we turn on the lights. Turns out it's a rope, not a snake.
Yeah, tell that to your body.
Now you start to calm down. Well, the point here is it was always a rope. And your perception of it created this massive physiological, psychophysiological response.
So it's just like in the Matrix when there is no spoon.
Exactly.
Speaking of which, we were talking about organs. You know, you hear a lot of these stories about people getting transplants. You know, we're talking about mind-body connection. What about the people that get transplanted organs and start to take on characteristics of their host?
I had a patient who had a kidney transplant. He started having these really weird dreams, and he decided, this is before the internet, he decided to try to find the parents of the guy, who was a young guy. So he looked in the newspaper 48 hours before his transplant, found all the deaths by car accidents, motorcycle accidents, and he decided this was the one. He went to this woman's house and said, I think I have your son's kidney. And at first she was very off-putting, and then he said, look, I need to know this. I'm having dreams of this, 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 and this. And the mother said, that's my son. And they actually wound up with a relationship because the mom felt that part of her son was still alive in this man. And you know, this is not theoretical for me. This guy told me the story right in front of me. It was very powerful.
And I think the healing and the potential benefit and the closure, regardless of the mechanism, is really the reward there. I mean, regardless of the healing at any cost is still healing, and that's an amazing thing. What's amazing to me as well is we are getting more of the biologic underpinnings to at least explain what we do know and theorize a mechanism of action, although these things haven't been proven yet. And I expect that many will be probably within the next 50 years or so. But, you know, the neurobiology of it is what I understand and what I'm trained in. And I'm seeing more and more how much it can explain what used to be more, like you said, fad or jokingly holistic hooey out there in the 80s and 90s is really what people intuitively know is how their own body operates, how they know when something's wrong within their own heart or mind, and then how the healing happens.
Well, just give anyone a psychoactive substance and you'll have proof of a mind-body connection.
Absolutely.
You know, and you know, if somebody takes an opiate, their mood is going to change.
Yeah, negative or positive. It's a profound.
That's right.
And
so there's a lot of data that proves this mind-body connection. Some of it is, you know, sort of biological, psychophysiological data. Some of it is observation, psychotherapy, treatment. It's all over the place. The trick is, how do we use it to promote health? Because we want, you know, I'm not transparent about what I want from my patients. I just say, I want you to be happy and healthy. You know, happy, I'll add productive if you like production. I'll add productive in your lives, but happy and healthy. Why else would people want to come and see us?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people do appreciate the validation of biology and science. It's not an absolute requirement for me anymore. I mean, I'm very left brain, and it's the way I was trained. But I've also been had an open mind enough to integrate a lot of the things that intuitively we know are true. And like I said, that gap is closing. But even something as simple, we've known a long time about hormones and chemical messengers, the response of stress and how it increases cortisol and norepinephrine, and the adrenaline rush you might get from a feared snake under your bed. But we're understanding more and more clearly how these lead to not only, you know, hypertension and some of the studies on acupuncture, but more serious illness, even cancers, anything from the adrenal fatigue and crash and failure to serious immunodeficiencies, which opens our body up and makes it vulnerable to a whole host of illnesses, really. And understanding that on even a cellular level, to me, is what's the most fascinating, especially when we appreciate that consciousness has its own effect on the body. And it's more easily measured and observed on a cellular level.
There's a whole science of psychoneuroimmunology that grew up, you know, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago, something like that. It's very powerful.
And it's dynamic. That's the thing. This isn't an anatomy book. Science is actually kind of coming alive and seeing the layers upon layers. Like, you know, it was easy to learn about the skeletal system, or easy to learn about, you know, the nervous system and seeing the body's overlaid nerves on bones, or seeing the vascular system as another layer. But now looking at the energetic body and the functional interplay between these various layers or systems, creating sort of an epigenetic presentation. You know, DNA itself, it was thought to be what? The recipe for making a human, the actual blueprint for how to reproduce on a cellular level, an exact copy. Well, we know identical twins aren't exact copies.
That's right.
They're far from it. If you really look on a cellular biology level, but understanding why is really where the mind-body connection has a therapeutic value.
And, in the late 60s, the Meningers Foundation brought some yogis over from India. And they found that they could do remarkable things, things that shouldn't happen, like they would have one breath in an hour and still somehow live. And they could slow their heart rate all the way down to the idea that, they should be dead, but they weren't. They could control their bodies with their minds. So what came out of that was biofeedback. Now, it's not quite as elaborate. I don't know too many people that can slow their heart rate down like that. But my teacher's teacher, my yoga teacher's teacher, David Swenson, when I went to a 3-day workshop, I watched him reroute the blood flow so we could get into these really hard poses. I saw one side of his body get white and the other got really, really red. And I'm saying, wow, that's how he got into that pose, because it was a spectacular thing. Now, I think if you asked him what he was doing, he wouldn't say, I'm rerouting the blood. He was just trying to get into that pose. But it was clear to me watching him what was going on, and that's a very sophisticated example. But when you have biofeedback, what they'll do is they'll put a sensor on the end of your finger, and you'll make the temperature get higher there. Well, that means the blood is going there. And gee, when the blood is in the extremities, we tend to relax.
Yeah, but measuring it is one thing. Knowing the how it works is another. Like, how is it that the thought is redirecting the blood flow? And we're starting to get actual answers to these questions. Like,
I thought the answer was it's a mystery.
No, we've got this all figured out. Do we need to put another quarter in the machine there? Where are you going? I'm just getting to the coup de grace.
No, my battery was just giving me yelling at me.
Other than DNA being simply a blueprint, thoughts themselves become the architect of our neurophysiology. For example, a thought can actually assemble proteins. I mean, we know how thoughts lay down memories. We understand that on a superficial level, but we also understand that thoughts can generate neuropeptides. These are chemical messengers. They're assembled, amino acid sequence. They're created and released into the blood. They can affect any different part of the body. They can activate a whole series of events within the cell. It can be, the basic concept of cell biology is cells that fire together wire together. So if you've generated this thought, which is generated a chemical messenger and neuropeptides, which can function both as a neurotransmitter and a neurohormone and endocrine function, then it can actually turn on cells. And when cells fire together, when they're activated, they can turn on regions of the brain, actual cellular tracts, which activate limbic structures, which have auto feedback into deeper brain structures. So there is real neurobiologic understanding of how thoughts can then not only create a physiologic state or alter a physiologic state, but then through single nucleotide proteins and excising areas of our DNA, they could actually go into our DNA and rewrite our DNA for that to be passed on to our offspring. So most of this DNA isn't junk DNA or useless DNA or DNA we've evolved out of needing. It may be the actual collection of experiences and memories of our progeny, handed down to us.
It's so important to be positive. If you look at a cat, and then you're hooked up to a PET scan, it'll show you a pattern. Now close your eyes and visualize the cat. You'll get the same pattern. Mm-hmm. The brain doesn't know the difference. So that's why I always tell people, be careful what you say about yourself, because your brain is believing it. Positivity works. It's part of this whole idea that there's a mind-body connection. And I saw this a lot when I did sports psychology, that I would have the players have very positive ideas. And even with the tennis player that I work with, we had one signal if she hit a good shot to reinforce it, another signal to flush the energy of a bad shot. And it really works.
I think some of the most successful athletes have reported similar types of training strategies. And, you know, the content of our show today is so important because if people just suddenly understood really the power that their thoughts have to not only change their neurochemistry and change their fundamental DNA or physiology on a DNA level, our behavior and our attitudes and our thoughts would change like that. And I think
Absolutely.
that part of what we talked about the first week, and also some of the fears of COVID and what we talked about last week, are the ingredients that are needed to grind the crucible of human existence to this new point where the world has changed. And that's going to be
that absolutely, because
and we've changed. We're about to change on a fundamental level. If we truly understand and appreciate that, it's everything changes.
We don't really have a choice on the change. It's directing the change, and I decided when I started doing sports psychology that I would treat everybody who came to see me as a professional athlete. Instead of thinking of them as broken, I was thinking, that's a pathology model. I think of people as like guitars that need to be tuned.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're tuned and it's vibrationally tuned, then, and you get an optimal performance in whatever it is, whether you want to have optimal performance as a father, it doesn't have to be as a tennis player, it could be optimal performance in your job, optimal performance playing the guitar, whatever it is that you want to do, you'll be happier. You're thinking positively. There really is something to that. And I think that it reflects in health outcomes. If we come all the way back to the ancient practices, the vibrational practices, the chanting, the dancing, the music, being in nature, that if we're in tune, we're going to be a lot happier, we're going to be a lot healthier. This is kind of 1 + 1 is 2. But in our science, we've kind of forgotten that 1 + 1 is 2.
Yes,
and it really
something has been holding us back. And I think, we've talked about what can COVID do. COVID has everyone's attention. It has everyone's attention on planet Earth.
But you're kind of starting to talk about next week's show, Mark.
That's exactly my segue is because we now are starting to fully appreciate that mind-body connection and our ability to influence it and the necessity for not only connection with ourselves, but each other and humanity as a whole. Next week, we're going to talk about how the world has changed. And
it ain't going back.
And it's not going back. And to me, it potentially is a change for the better. So we're going to make sure next week that it's a change for the better. And we're going to talk about a lot of fun things on what that means.
The Chinese pictogram for crisis has 2 pictures in it, danger and opportunity. And yeah, there is danger, but there's a real opportunity now to take a look and to make things better. And that's what next week's show is going to be about. So I hope you guys will tune in.
I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, very cool, Mark. It's great talking to you as always.
All right, likewise. We'll see you next week. Be well.
Peace out, man. Peace out.